I'm Nick Newton, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this episode, Will and I will break down Florida's likeliest annual opponents if the 2024 SEC expansion goes to the model that a lot of people believe it will, the 9-game model with that 3-team format, those 3 fixed annual teams. Let's try to determine who those 3 annual opponents will be, and we'll give our reasoning behind each. Todd Monken departs Athens for the NFL. How will Kirby compare to Saban when it comes to dealing with turnover with a key assistant on the offensive side of the ball? Lost that defensive coordinator last year, filled in Muschamp, didn't miss a beat really, but Kirby's defensive guy. How will it work out on the offensive side of the ball? A new NIL bill will create a change in the landscape within the state. We'll talk about that, just signed into law. And how does Florida's support staff spending stack up compared to its rivals? Got some numbers on that to discuss with you here. Will, 2 bits might be on the longer side, so let's just dive right in tonight, man. So let's talk about Florida's 3 likeliest opponents if the SEC expands to the model we all believe it will, with that 3 fixed annual opponent system. Basically, I want to get rid of the riffraff first, and I'm going to give you my logic for each, and I want to see if you got a problem with any of these here. So the teams I give little chance to right off the bat: Missouri, which they're probably the most misplaced team in the current SEC format. They're likely to renew some of those Big 12 connections with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma. Vanderbilt, the SEC should just try to be as regional as they can with the Commodores. I'm thinking like Tennessee, Kentucky, Ole Miss type of fitting for the Commodores. Texas A&M, great addition to the league overall. They're a good occasional opponent, but don't see it being an annual matchup for the Gators. Bama, plenty of demands on Bama. LSU wants them annually. Texas probably wants a piece. Oklahoma. There's a lot of different, in the course, Auburn. I didn't even say the Iron Bowl there, but yeah, so Bama's got enough pulling at them. I don't believe that we are going to be in that mix. I do believe that Texas or Oklahoma is going to get matched up with Bama too. Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Arkansas. I'm putting them in the same boat because as Gator fans, meh. On all 3 of those, we're not exactly, it doesn't make or break the football season if we're playing either one of those 3 opponents. So of that group of little chance to not likely to don't care, how do you feel about that group that I just gave you?
I mean, I think it's probably right. I would love to see Vanderbilt every year just because you're basically penciling in a win. But, we've talked, it's funny, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have looked at Kentucky or South Carolina or any of those teams. Missouri, certainly back then, since they weren't even in the conference, we wouldn't have looked at those teams and said, hey, there's a rivalry there or anything like that. And it's like those things haven't, like the Kentucky thing has heated up a little bit recently, but it's the same thing with Mississippi States and Ole Misses and that of the world. There isn't a connection to Florida, so it makes sense that you'd want to sort of keep those guys out west and have things closer to home for Florida. But I think one of the things you got to really be careful about here is that the ones you don't care about are also the teams you can beat. So if the schedule turns out to be something where you're playing, Auburn, Alabama, and Georgia or something, it's going to be a much tougher schedule for you every year than somebody else. That's one thing they're going to really have to grapple with is the fairness of it all.
I will say this though, if you do have tougher opponents in your annual 3, you're going to get more of the 6. Obviously those teams will be worked in within the 6 opponents that rotate each year too. So that's a factor as well. So your 6 will be an easier group if you have 3 tougher ones that you're holding on to. All right. For the must-have, I only have one non-negotiable game. I know you know what it is, Will. The world's largest outdoor cocktail party with Georgia. They've always been the chief conference rival, and nothing should change there. Not even the game in Jacksonville. Keep it in Jacksonville. That's a beautiful game in college football. Doesn't need to change whatsoever. However, I'm looking at the other games, Will. I don't see a single one as a must absolutely 100% have, and I'm putting those into the contender category. Would you be upset if any of those other teams slide off the schedule and Georgia were the only one that on that must-have schedule?
No, I mean, obviously, Florida Georgia's the one that has to stay. I think 20 years ago, back when I graduated, I would have said Tennessee needs to be on
Right.
there. LSU's a little bit of a disappointing one, like in terms of if they got left off, just because that has turned into sort of a bellwether game for Florida every year. They've been a permanent opponent every year, and they're good. They're sort of in the same boat as Florida when
Yeah.
it comes to recruiting. And, they're not Alabama and they're not what Georgia is now, but they're always a very good team. And so it's a good game, right? I mean, that's one of those where, we got great memories with the jump pass and then the fake to the fake pass for Tebow that then ends, or the fake run for Tebow that then ends up in Lewis Murphy's hands in that LSU game, beating Jamarcus Russell, sort of the first step to get in the national championship. 2012, Gillisley just being able to run all over him. Like those sorts of memories with LSU exists. Even the
Great
Anthony
moments.
Richardson game from a couple of years ago, where
Yeah.
all of a sudden we thought we had a guy who was going to lead Florida to the promised land. Turned out that was an up, and the Georgia game a week later was a down, and that's all we got for a year straight. But that's the one that I look at and say, if somebody told me who's going to drop off your schedule and you'd be disappointed, I'd say LSU. That's one that my family's gone to a lot, and we always have a lot of fun with that.
Let's talk about that one too. We'll get to those on the contenders. So the rest I have split up. There's 7 teams left here, and I'm split up in the series contenders versus wild cards. Let's talk about those contenders first. I first had, by the way, 2006 LSU jump pass. Take Casey back in the end zone. Take Casey falling down. Contenders, Tennessee. So though we've had bad blood with the Vols pre-Spurrier in the 80s, it was kind of it was nasty rivalry in the 80s. Florida played Tennessee in the Gator Bowl one year, and then they hired Doug Dickey right after the game. So that was there's been some bad blood before the 90s there, but this rivalry is very new. This developed in the 90s with Peyton Manning and Spurrier and everything. All time, it's a 2.3 point per game differential too. So the game, a lot of good games. That's why it's been particularly memorable. But of the 52 meetings all time, this is not a traditional rival. Of the 52 meetings all time, only 33 have occurred. 33 of the 52 have occurred since the annual pairing began in 1990. Meaning the Gators and Vols, they only met 19 times before 1990. So it's a similar effect with Tennessee and Georgia. Actually, those two only played 20 times. So I'm like, who's Tennessee playing if they're not playing Florida and Georgia every year? They play a lot of Alabama and Kentucky in there. But I'd say Tennessee, you're in state with Vandy. They also have demands where they got must-haves with Vandy. I think that Alabama rivalry is probably more precious to them to protect if they're going to narrow it down too. So that just leaves them with a little option. I think Tennessee, there might be a good shot. Tennessee's left out of that mix. So South Carolina, one-sided rivalry till 2010. It's 30, 10, and 3 overall. 6 South Carolina wins since 2010, though. However, it is geographically friendly for a road game. So it's one of the 3 closest SEC schools with UGA and Auburn. The Spurrier angle, too, is interesting with the Gamecocks rivalry, but is it a must-have in the top 3? I don't know about that. I think that might be one that's easy to move on from. Kentucky, outside of Georgia, who we played 101 times, and Auburn, who we played 85 times, no team has met up with the Gators more than the Wildcats at 73 times. Kentucky's won 3 of the last 5, but overall trails Florida in the series 53-20, including that 31 straight game losing streak from 87 to 17. The Cats and the Gators, they've met annually, though, since 1967. So this is actually a pretty traditional rival, but is it the type that is Kentucky really etched in the history books with Florida? Like, do we care as much? But you brought up LSU. You gave a little preview here. LSU, even though Georgia might be our most hated rival, I would argue that LSU has been our best pure rivalry game for the last 2 decades. Many classic moments in this series, which have been split. The series right now stands at 33, 33, and 3 through 69 meetings, and it has a 1.7 point per game differential. So if those games seem crazy, yeah, they have been. So it's often season-defining game, like you called it, the bellwether game. Florida and LSU, 5 national titles combined between each of them over the last 20 seasons. And unrelated to actual football, I would actually say from a pure visual standpoint, LSU Whites versus the Gator Blues might be one of the best uniform matchups in college football. So, Will, I gave you on the series contenders, I gave you Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, and LSU. Of that group, you got to get rid of 2. Who are you dropping?
I mean, I think you're dropping South Carolina, and I think you're probably dropping Tennessee. I think LSU is the one that I want to see.
Hmm.
And then Kentucky is the one that has the history in terms of, Florida and Kentucky have played each other a lot. And I think at some point, and this is the thing, is my guess is they're sort of going to divide this up into sort of the elite teams. And so there's 7 teams that have won national titles when you bring it, or at least have gone to the playoffs when you look at when you bring in Oklahoma and Texas, and then you've got everybody else. And maybe you say Texas A&M sort of rises into that quote unquote elite category just because of the pockets that they have there. But then you got Vandy, Tennessee, USC, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss on that down list. I'm guessing what they're probably going to do is give everybody, like, if you're in the elite category, you're going to get 2 from that category and then one of the also rans, as opposed to the also rans, which will get 2 also rans and then an elite. And then they'll have to sort of massage it a little bit because of rivalries, right? I mean, you're not going to lose Florida, Georgia. You're not going to lose Bama, Auburn. You're not going to lose the Egg Bowl. You're not going to lose Oklahoma, Texas at the state fair. You're probably not
Hmm.
going to lose Texas A&M either. I think that's one that they're going to try to play up if you've got that. And then I don't think you're going to lose LSU, Arkansas either. And that's why I think actually LSU is the one that will drop. I don't want to see them drop. I think they'll drop because I think LSU, Arkansas is going to stay. I think they'll want LSU, Bama. And once you've done that, are you going to stick them with Florida? I think you struggle to do that. So if it was up to me, I would keep LSU on the list, but I don't think that's probably going to happen.
Well, let's talk about that. We'll talk through those teams too, because they got demands on their end too. How hilarious would it be, by the way, if Texas joined the SEC and A&M was not an annual opponent? That would be pretty funny, I think. So I got 3 wild cards here for the Gators. The first of which being Auburn. It's one of our oldest rivalries. I mean, guys our age, will, we're early 40s, late 30s here. This is not one of the teams we think of as a genuine rival, but this is one of the oldest rivalries. It was a casualty to SEC expansion, though, but they still played all throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. So it's one of the 3 closest opponents within the SEC in Eastern Alabama there. Second most common opponent in Gator football history behind Georgia with 85 all-time meetings. The Gators and the Tigers met every year between 1927 and 2002. So there's the only exception, 1941 for World War II. But 81 all-time meetings through 2002, 4 since. So it's been a dormant rivalry, but it absolutely was one of our main rivals for many, many years. LSU maybe have taken the place of that. You can argue in the last 20 years here. But the other 2, Texas and Oklahoma, just because I think there's a lot of questions on, like, how do they want to mix them into the SEC? You got to find those new opponents too. It can't just be all tradition, right? I don't know about that for if you're talking about just the annual meetings, because Florida has no history with either one of these teams. 3 all-time meetings with Texas, 2 all-time with Oklahoma. It's about it's a 1,183 mile trek to Norman, 17 and a half hour drive, and 1,022 mile trip to Austin from Gainesville, 15-hour drive there. So the likelihood of Texas, I believe, is low, because I believe their must-haves are A&M and Oklahoma, which leaves room for one more to fill. I see that being LSU, Arkansas, Missouri, potentially Bama. You work them in with Bama potentially. Likelihood of Oklahoma is also low, because I think them and A&M and Texas are going to be a natural 3, leaving that LSU, Mizzou, Bama mix. And I also think Mizzou, you talk about their fit. Where do they fit in? I think they're going to get that natural pairing. They'll probably keep Arkansas, but are they going to get? You got to think between Texas, A&M, and OU, they're going to be with 2 of those 3, I would think, as well. So, first off, would you agree Texas and Oklahoma not likely as a pairing for Florida?
Yeah, I think anything over 1,000 miles is going to get ruled out by everybody,
Right.
because these are annual meetings. You're
Right.
going to want people to travel, right? And so to put Oklahoma or put Texas in an annual meeting with Florida means, yeah, the first couple of years, Florida fans will travel out there. The first couple of times, it'll be, hey, it's new going to Norman, it's new going to Austin. But you'll be able to get that in the rotation, as opposed to trying to make it into an annual thing where, let's be honest, how many times have I been out to Baton Rouge? Now, I may try to do it this year just because it might be the last time we're there for a while.
Good point.
But,
Good point.
but it's one of those things where it's a trek. And so to get out there is difficult. And I think they're probably going to try to take that into account when they're deciding who's going to play who. Like, and I'm not saying it's not going to be 500 miles, but I think 1,000 miles. I mean, now you're talking about, 12, 13-hour drive to get to where you need to go. That's a long way to do for an annual thing. I expect things to be very geographical when they roll this out, other than the rivals, if those rivals happen to be further apart than that. But that's one of the good things about the rivalries, right? Is it's usually somebody right down the road.
So we have to whittle it down to 3. Georgia's in. So we need 2 more for the Gators here. We are between Kentucky, LSU, and Auburn. Let's go through Kentucky. Who's Kentucky's must-haves? You got to think Tennessee. I don't really think they have another must-have in the mix, do you? Would you go anywhere else for Kentucky?
I mean, it's Kentucky. Who cares?
Yeah. I think that answers the question, though, right there. LSU, you have I would think LSU is going to probably try to protect that Alabama matchup, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so.
I think A&M might be a casualty with them. And then I'm trying to think, like, maybe Auburn, like Arkansas potentially. I know they've tried to make that, but that's not a super competitive game all the time. Maybe they get paired with an Oklahoma or Texas too. I can see them just because of the geography being good. I feel like Texas would be a natural fit. But so would you go Bama, Texas, and Florida for LSU? That kind of stacks them up pretty good. And then Auburn, you have Alabama's a must for Auburn. I think Georgia's a must. So would you be Bama, Georgia, Florida every single year? You got to add Florida to that mix with Bama and Georgia. Is that really fair to Auburn? Oh boy, I don't know, man. So I actually think, even though I like the idea of the Auburn rivalry coming back, of that 3, because Auburn has Bama and Georgia, I'm kind of with you. I don't know if they're going to stick them with Florida as a 3rd. Would you think that would be something that would rule the Tigers out?
Somebody's going to get screwed in all this, right? In terms of the way things are moving, just because there's no way to equitably distribute 8 real sort of top tier and 8 lower tier over a 3-game period. It doesn't really work out that way. You just end up with, some people are going to end up with what we would consider 2 lower tier teams and an upper tier team, and somebody's going to end up with 3 upper tier teams in there. I think that's kind of probably going to be pretty likely for Auburn. I think, who else do you put them with? Like Tennessee? If you're looking at Auburn, even that's not necessarily a cakewalk. So if you're going to do that, why not have Auburn with Alabama, Georgia, and Florida? And then you have Florida with Georgia and Auburn. And then, I know I ruled out South Carolina earlier, but I think my distance argument is making me come back around to maybe South Carolina being in that sort of triumvirate there. The other thing is, this is the weird thing to me. Like, I look at it and I get the idea of traditional rivals, but the NFL adjusts the schedule every year. What you're really doing is you're setting up, like, if I were in charge, I would have 4 divisions, right? And the division, and then you do it like the NFL, where you set up the 4th place team in the division plays all the 4th place teams from the year before. The 3rd place plays all the 3rd places. And so you end up with because you need 6. So it'd be the 4th place plays the 3rd and the 4th, right? And then the 3rd place plays the 3rd and the 4th.
But that won't ever happen, because that would impact the SEC's pocketbook for making the playoffs, because you get money. You don't get money if the AFC East puts 3 teams in the playoffs.
Maybe, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure that's true, because I think with a 12-team playoff, you're going to get to a point where if you distribute things evenly and everybody goes 10-3, everybody's going to be in the playoff, right? Like, so there actually is value to scheduling to where a team like Alabama doesn't go 12-0 or 13-0 every year. And that Alabama has to play Georgia and Oklahoma and Texas, if Georgia, Oklahoma, and Texas are the 3 best teams in the conference. But again, if they're going to do the 3 and the 6, it's just weird to me that you'd sit there and you'd do it where you have these 3 permanent rivals, but you wouldn't just try to division it off, because once you division it off, you've got your 3 rivals, right, in a 4-team division.
But we're not doing that exercise right now. We're picking the 3 rivals right now. So,
well, I mean, so again, I would say Georgia, Auburn, and South Carolina would be the 3 that I would put in there. If you told me, weighing all the different things they're trying to do, mainly make sure that you're maximizing TV revenue, that you're maintaining the key rivalries, and gives you the ability to adjust the schedule, right? You could theoretically, in the case where you give Auburn those 3, you could give them a rotation that makes sense, right? Where they're only getting hit by a big boy every once in a while on the backside, because for the most part, it's going to be the also rans who rotate through. And, I honestly, I don't know whether that's necessarily a bad thing. I think if you go 2-1 against three elites and then you play all the also rans, everybody will be like, wow, you had a really tough schedule. That's not always true. And the other thing is the SEC goes up and down quite a bit too. So I think what we're going to find is that the things that we think right now, I think we all sort of thought Auburn falling off the schedule was a good thing for Florida overall in terms of their ability to win the SEC. That's been sort of true. Auburn's been okay, but picking up LSU has probably been a thorn in Florida's side as many times as it's been a benefit. Again, that 2006 game, that one sort of sets the stage for the championship. The 2008 game sort of set the stage for the national championship. The tip ball that went to Harvard in that one. And then you've got the 2009 game. I think it was the '09 game that was the concussion game for Tebow, right? And so those sorts of things sort of set the stage for what happens. So I guess I look at it and I go, if you really want to be an elite team in the SEC, from a recruiting perspective, I'd probably want three elites in my schedule, but the three I'd go with would be Georgia, Auburn, and South Carolina.
I think South Carolina, I did like I think they'll have a case for Tennessee and Georgia. I think Tennessee's gonna be tough to get paired with, so they might be available there. I do think they will weigh some historic stuff too. And I don't know if Kentucky has a lot of great natural fits there too. So I did like keeping Kentucky in our mix. So I think Georgia, Kentucky, and either Auburn or LSU, it's tough. But I really think the Bama and Georgia element of Auburn, they're going to let Auburn maybe have a little more say in who that third team is. And I think you're looking probably at a Mississippi State or Ole Miss over a Florida. So I'm going to go with Georgia, Kentucky, and LSU as the three for Florida that seem to make the most sense on that. So you got Georgia. So you got Georgia, Auburn, and South Carolina. Bringing back that Auburn rivalry. I got Georgia, Kentucky, LSU for my three. So we arrived at different conclusions, but walk you through the logic at least. So any final comments on that before we move on to 4-bits?
Other than the fact that it's going to be fun, that it's going to be different, right? And that's one of the things. I think the East had gotten kind of stale over the last few years, where it's like, hey, Georgia's just going to run roughshod over the East. Florida's the only team that can stop them. And for a while, it was Alabama's going to run roughshod over everybody, and only Georgia in the SEC championship game is going to be able to stop them, or maybe only Auburn in the Iron Bowl every once in a while is going to be able to stop them. This hopefully opens it up to be more than that, right? That if you're going to play 9 conference games, it's going to be harder for you to miss the elites, and you're not just going to be able to basically coast through like Georgia's going to do next year, because their schedule is terrible.
Don't even want to talk about it. Well, one aspect here, this nice transition here, Will. One aspect that might hurt Georgia this next year is Todd Monken is leaving Athens. He took a job as the offensive coordinator with the Baltimore Ravens, and unless Kirby is the next Nick Saban, which please God, I hope he's not. But yeah, I mean, he might be, unfortunately. Usually losing a key assistant actually matters for most programs. So let's see what Todd Monken actually did here. He came to Georgia. First off, he had been the Southern Miss head coach, did a couple years in the NFL, really turned around that Southern Miss program after working with Brandon Whedon in Oklahoma State. But per ESPN, when he was an NFL assistant, offensive coordinator with Tampa Bay, and then Cleveland Browns, the Buccaneers had the NFL's best passing attack in 2018. And Baker Mayfield threw for a career high 3,827 yards for the Browns in 2019. So he was brought into Georgia, and Georgia really went to the next level on that offensive side of the ball. Developed former walk-on quarterback Stetson Bennett, and Bennett, obviously, Heisman Trophy finalist this past year. Points per game each year went up from 32.3 in 2020 to 38.6 in 21 to 41.1 this past year, or averaged over 500 yards of offense this past year as well. So just really great turnaround, considering when Kirby first got to Athens that first year under Jim Chanton, he averaged 24.5 points per game. So definitely that the offensive side of the ball was the part that maybe was holding Georgia back a little bit there. And Monken just took it to the next level. I'm surprised it took him that long. I would have thought he would have got a job after last year, and he got hired pretty late in the cycle this year. I would have expected him to be a strong head coaching candidate for a lot of colleges, but I guess his aim was to get back to the NFL. Will, Todd Monken departing Georgia, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's a good thing regardless, right? I mean, Monken was sort of the final piece to the puzzle that they needed. Their defense. Now, look, I mean, I think the defense won them the championship 2 years ago, but I think the offense, especially in that game against Ohio State and the game against Missouri too, the offense had to come through and win the game a couple of times this year. And maybe even in the national championship game against Alabama last year, had to do that as well. And Monken, up until Monken came in, you could see sort of a playing not to lose type mentality on Georgia's offense. The fake punt with Justin Fields, the loss when Tua came into the game in the national championship, and what was that, 2017? Where Tua comes in and they basically just sat on the ball and tried to run out the clock, and didn't really go for the jugular. And Alabama was able to pull that one out. I think, look, Georgia's going to be up there regardless of who the offensive coordinator is. But, a couple of bad play calls against Missouri this year. And Georgia, as a one-loss Georgia team after losing to Missouri, getting into the playoff, I mean, they would have over a two-loss Alabama team, I suppose. But you know what I mean? Like there would have been some opportunities to sort of say, look, there's some chinks in the armor here with these guys, and it doesn't now, look, most of the games they won going away, and it wouldn't have mattered who the offensive coordinator was. But the Ohio State game and the Missouri game, I think, are ones you look at and say, look, the offensive coordinator is going to make a difference. And so I think, I Monken came in and they won the national championship 2 of the 3 years he was there. I don't think you can necessarily, I mean, he was obviously a major contributor to that, a major contributor to Bennett's development, and a major contributor to what Kirby Smart's built there. And so to believe that that's not going to impact them, especially with Bennett leaving, I think is probably short-sighted. We'll see with Bobo coming in, we'll see what kind of offense he's installing. Is he sort of maintaining what Monken had, running the same sort of scheme? But even that, like the scheme, I mean, and one of the things I put out when Bobo was hired was I put a Bobo with the shaking hands emoji with Steve Adazio, and the idea being that Adazio was running Mullen's offense and was running Urban Meyer's offense. The offense looked completely different, right? The play calling, the timing, the idea of when you take a shot. There's a feel to being an offensive coordinator, and Monken seemed to have that feel. Like there was always a time that he was able to figure out a way to get Bowers the ball, or go straight to Washington, or pop a run when they needed to pop one. Like, and granted, Georgia had more talent than everybody else, but still, the offensive coordinator has to make the right call. And Monken was able to do that. We'll see if Bobo can do that.
Yeah, you average 41 points a game. I think you're doing something right there. Bobo, like you said, Mike Bobo, the former Dogs quarterback, hired as the team's offensive coordinator, second stint at UGA in the same position. He was the OC under Mark Richt from 2007 to 2014. Colorado State head coach from 15 to 19, went 20 and 35 out there. South Carolina's offensive coordinator under current Georgia defensive coordinator Will Muschamp in 2020, and Bobo spent the 2021 season as Auburn's offensive coordinator before returning to his alma mater as an analyst last fall. Smart Bobo, they actually were teammates together in 95 to 97, and Bobo on his resume worked with quarterbacks such as Matthew Stafford and Aaron Murray. 2012, he was finalist for the Broyles Award. So I know recent stops haven't been as kind to Mike Bobo, but he's definitely got a great track record, great resume, and he's going to be working with a lot of talent there in Athens like we haven't seen before. But what I'm interested in seeing, Will, is how Alabama is Georgia now, because you look at Saban's offensive coordinator's track record here, and let's go through it here. Major Applewhite, 1 year, 2007, he leaves for Texas to become the assistant head coach out of Texas. Fills in with Jim McElwain, who's there for 4 seasons, which, by the way, is the longest offensive coordinator tenure that Saban has ever had. That should have been the red flag right there. Well, 4 seasons as a coordinator for Saban? Couldn't get – so anyways, leaves for Colorado State for the head coaching job, 2012 through 13. 2 years of Doug Nussmeier, left for Michigan to become the offensive coordinator. 2014 through 2016, Lane Kiffin, 3 years, head coach FAU after that. Then you enter the co-offensive coordinator phase. You got Dable in 2017. He was there for 1 year, left for the Bills. The co-OC that year was Mike Loxley, who was there for 17 and 18, 2 full years before getting the head coach at Maryland job. Gaddis in 18, 1 year, left for OC at Michigan. Sark for 2 seasons after that. Of course, Sark filled in for the national title game for Kiffin too, but left for the head coach job at Texas. Bill O'Brien, 21-22, left for the OC at New England, fills in with Tommy Rees this year from Notre Dame. And basically, this is the 10th offensive coordinator in Saban's 16 seasons in Tuscaloosa. 4 have left for head coaching jobs, 2 for NFL coordinator jobs, and 3 have left for either assistant head coach or offensive coordinator at Alabama or Michigan. So Saban has no problem turning it over and keeping the tide rolling. Will we see the same on that side of the ball? Defensively, you saw the replacement with Smart this year, replacing Dan Laney with Will Muschamp. But that's Kirby's side of the ball. The offensive side of the ball, we haven't seen this as much with Kirby. It'll be interesting to see how he places such a key part to the last few seasons and definitely a key part to the Georgia's title runs.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? I mean, in 2008, we thought the Florida dynasty was underway and was going to last for the next decade, right? And then you got Dan Mullen going to Mississippi State. You got Percy Harvin leaving for the pros. Tebow was sort of able to patch a lot of that stuff in 2009. The team was really good, makes the SEC championship game, loses to Alabama, but then just absolutely blitzkrieg Cincinnati in the bowl game. A very successful year, and then the bottom fell out. And was that because Dan Mullen left? No, I don't. But I think it's because there were cracks in the foundation of the program. They had made sacrifices. You know, there's a reason why there's going to be a 30 for 30 coming up on that 2008 team. They had made sacrifices to win. And some of those sacrifices, I think, impacted the culture. And that's the thing I think I'd be looking at more than anything. I mean, you know, there's obviously been terrible news out of Athens with the crash with Devin Willock. But then you've had Stetson Bennett getting arrested for drunken disorderly conduct. You had Ra Thomas, a transfer wide receiver from Mississippi State, coming in, and he got arrested, and I believe has been dismissed from the team. So, you know, there have been sort of incidents that you don't really associate with Saban. And I don't know whether it's necessarily coordinator type turnover that ends up causing these problems. I think what it ends up being is that, you know, when you win, it's really difficult to remain hungry. It's really difficult to remain disciplined. It's really difficult to not just think you're going to roll the ball out there and win. And Georgia is going to see the same thing that I do when I look at their schedule and go, there's no excuse for them not to go 12-0 next year, given the schedule that's going to be out there. I don't know whether or not you know, we saw it with the Chiefs this past week. They win the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden they're sitting there talking about it being this is what we do in a rebuilding year. And, you know, nobody thought we'd be here. It's like, wait, nobody had Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, guys. Like, let's hold on for a minute. Like the odds at the beginning of the year had you, I think it's like the 3rd most likely to make to the Super Bowl. So, you know, I think the same thing applies to Georgia. That's what I'm looking for. And, you know, Bobo was there with Richt. Richt was good, but not great. And if they replicate good but not great on the offensive side of the ball, but they continue to replicate what Kirby Smart has been able to do on the defensive side of the ball, this team's going to be fine. You know, but again, I mean, I think whenever you lose a coordinator like this, it's a risk, because all of a sudden, if you become more deliberate, if you become more predictable, if everybody can pick up on your tendencies and you're not necessarily a completely gifted play caller, then all of a sudden the couple of plays that separated you before, or the big plays that you were able to make, just aren't going to be there. And so how's Georgia going to do when all of a sudden the offense can't just dial it up and go right down the field in a critical juncture, and now the defense has to get a stop? I think they'll get their share of wins. I think this year you might even see them again run the table. You might see them, you know, but if they lost in the playoff or something, I think there's a possibility that this could cascade out of control pretty quickly. Again, in 2008, none of us would have seen Florida falling apart. And one of the most impressive things, I think, you know, you listed all that turnover at the offensive coordinator position, but one of the most impressive things about Saban is just that year after year after year, those players are always out there trying to prove something. Those players are always out there playing hard, being relatively disciplined. He hasn't had a lot of discipline problems there, and he's been able to maintain it in a way that no other coach has been able to do. Even if you think about Meyer at Ohio State, right? It was sort of a quick fire that then burned out. Obviously, Ryan Day's been able to keep that going a little bit, but you know, there isn't a lot of historical evidence for the idea that you're just going to be able to build and then maintain like Saban's been able to do. And so I'm really curious to see what happens at Georgia.
Another key difference with this Bobo hire versus Saban hires, guys like Dable, Loxley, Gaddis, Sark, O'Brien, all those guys are coming from the outside, hungry to prove themselves. They got something to prove about themselves, right? So Saban doesn't necessarily always hire from within the building for that position. I know some of those guys might have been analysts or something for a year working with the team in some capacity, and then they come back or they get promoted in that capacity. But for the most part, these are former head coaches somewhere else or a young up and coming guy like Gaddis, and they're trying to get back in the game to some extent. So there's a lot of motivation on their part to do something. Dable was a longtime NFL offensive coordinator before he came to Tuscaloosa too, and goes up to Buffalo, does great with Josh Allen, great coach with the Giants right now. So I maybe bringing in that kind of family feel, that internal. You got Muschamp, who's a Georgia grad. You got Bobo, who's a Georgia grad. The stability looks like it's going to be good there for a while. But is it too much of the same type of ideas coming together where, Monken was an outside hire that came in? So I wonder if that outside hungry hire for Bama is going to be a little different than what it is at Georgia right now if you're hiring within the family, or as they call it up at Georgia, keeping it between the hedges.
Something like that. We can only hope that everything falls apart and cascades. I don't have high hopes for it. I think Kirby Smart, one, the fact that he's a Georgia guy means that he's probably not necessarily looking for that next jump. And then the other thing is he's not going to want to leave like Urban Meyer did, where he basically says it's broken and then leaves and takes a year off and goes to Ohio State. I don't think that's probably in the cards. Obviously, the NFL might come calling for Kirby at some point along the way. And if he sees cracks in the facade in terms of what he's built, then there's an opportunity to go out there. Look, I think Georgia's going to be good for the foreseeable future. At the same time, I think we all thought Florida was going to be good for the foreseeable future in 2008, and that fell apart really, really quickly. And that's kind of the history of most of college football. You got teams like Nebraska under Osborne, who were good for a really long time, Oklahoma under Switzer, that was good for a fairly long period of time, under Stoops for a pretty long period of time. But even under Stoops, Oklahoma had sort of some ups and downs and things like that. Bobby Bowden at Florida State, Spurrier at Florida was sort of a longer run. Those days of those long runs are sort of over, other than Saban. Obviously, Smart had an inside seat there to see Saban do that. So he knows what it takes to sort of reload and go for multiple championships. And look, I mean, no one's had a three-peat, I think, ever in college football. So if you can't get motivated to do something no one's ever done, I think maybe you got some issues. But, again, I just look at it and I say college football is, as much as we like to think of it as a predictable thing, and in some ways it is, it's unpredictable when you get to the SEC, where someone can pick you off, or a quarterback gets hurt, or you have to change offensive coordinators, or look, Alabama lost 2 games by I think by 4 points total this year, and so that happens to Georgia next year. They're not even going to be in the playoff, and so we can always hope.
Well, yeah, Alabama is definitely the exception, not the rule, but it certainly looks like the pieces are together to still be successful at Georgia for quite some time here. But it'll be interesting to observe here. Mike Bobo, new offense coordinator for the Georgia Bulldogs. So let's move on here to 6 bits. NIL changes to the Florida state law. From Andy Staples of The Athletic, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Bill HB7B with Billy Napier, Mike Norvell on hand, repealing the state's restrictions for college athletes to make money on NIL deals. It removes the restrictions put in place by the initial law, and it now allows coaches to assist players in facilitating deals. Previously, a school or a coach helping a player get an NIL deal would have violated the law. The new version also establishes liability protection for coaches, so that decisions such as benching or suspending a player doesn't open the coach to a lawsuit because the decision affected the player's NIL deals. So universities will still not be allowed to pay student athletes directly, but we'll get to that in a minute. Will, first, the NIL bill here in Florida.
I mean, it certainly helps with some of the problems we've been told about what's been going on with NIL. Obviously, sort of the most egregious NIL situation over the past year is Jaden Rashada. We've talked about that extensively, and one of the big problems there, I suspect, is that the program and the collective weren't able to communicate in a way that allowed them to make sure that everything got taken care of. And all of a sudden things go wrong, and the school has to, the player, I'm sure, is sitting there going, "Guys, I need you to support me. I need you to come in here and fix this." And the staff has to, and the staff legally has to say, "No, we can't. Sorry, we can't support you." Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we've been talking for years now you and I about how, these guys are really, I mean, it's pay for play regardless, because these guys, if they were just going to school as art majors, they would not be garnering $1 million NIL deals. And so it is pay for play regardless of whether you want to admit it or not.
I
All this
think
does is,
Justin Fields just gave an interview on Pardon My Take, talking about how much he got paid to go to Ohio State, and he definitely did not play in the NIL era.
well, so it turns out that's been done for a while. What was it, Jimbo Fisher, who said now you can just see the numbers as opposed to what was going on before? But
Now it's legal.
yeah,
So
well, and now the numbers are bigger, right? Because
yeah.
you didn't have collectives, you had boosters who maybe would write a check for, or stuff a bag with 10, 15 grand or something like that, as opposed to what's actually going on these days. But look, I mean, this is going to help. Transparency helps. Allowing people to interact freely helps when you have markets. Why not? Right? What is the harm? There's no harm in a coach helping set this stuff up. If anything, it allows the coach and the collective to set valuations that make sense for particular players, and make sure that everybody is in lockstep so that no one gets taken advantage of. Now, on the back end, and they didn't put anything in here in the bill, I don't think, about this, is I hope they start building protections in for the players. Like we talked, I think, last week about having sort of a uniform contract for NIL. That I think would be a great step forward for the legislature to take too. But it's not a coincidence that Napier and Norvell were on hand for this. Certainly the black eye from the Rashada thing, I think, sticks out in terms of why Florida might have been there. But this is something they've been pushing for a while. Most schools that weren't in Florida maybe weren't bound legally to not be able to get involved. At the same time, no one was getting prosecuted for this. This is one of those where it's sort of, it now gives them permission so they don't have to do it in the dark. But the state wasn't going to come after these coaches if they help facilitate NIL deals. And so, in some ways, I don't think this should change things. I think maybe for people who are trying to play by the letter of the law, it'll change things. But I never thought that was necessarily the best thing to do anyway, just because, really, you're going to sue your state university for going afoul on a rule that you want to change anyway. I suspect that this will help things out a little bit, but I don't think it's going to change all that much.
One of the aspects of NIL that both you and I have discussed is that this thing is far from being formed in the way it's going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. One of the lawsuits that's currently going on, you sent me an article on this today. This is from Michael McCann, Sports Law and Sportico. A 3-judge panel on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit heard dueling arguments for attorneys for the NCAA and former Villanova football player Trey Johnson and other athletes over whether Division I college athletes are employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The panel regarded the NCAA's core principle that college athletes shouldn't be paid as unpersuasive, and judges signaled that they view college athletes as employees. The panel's decision, expected later this year, could eventually lead to college athletes gaining recognition as employees who are owed wages akin to their work-study classmates. Meanwhile, universities and the NCAA would be on the hook to pay those athletes as joint employers. Will, there's all kinds of complications with this because you're looking at Title IX. So if they rule athletes should be employees, you're going to have to pay the football players the same thing that you're paying the women's track team, the same thing that you're paying the softball, the baseball. But so there's a lot of complications. This isn't talking about those $1 million players that are going to make the Tim Tebows of the world wealthy. This is talking about just basic payment, similar to what students who get paid in other capacities do. You look at it too. I actually didn't know this. I learned this today reading this article, that the military, one of the arguments the judges use is the military academies pay their cadets. Like the Army pays the cadets, the midshipmen get paid. So those guys are getting paid because they're technically in the military at school there. So that's okay. That gets past the NCAA. That's fine. But they brought up a whole bunch of other examples too. I didn't know that about the military branches, but it makes sense if you think about it. But the point is there's a bunch of different angles to cover in this lawsuit still. I don't expect a decision anytime soon, but it's certainly, if they rule in favor of this group bringing the case against the NCAA, you're going to see even more changes to what's going on with NIL and pay for play and all that stuff. And it's like you said in the text message you sent me, they're coming for that TV money. They're coming for that TV money because right now they're getting around that with NIL, but the TV money will dip their hands into the TV money at some point.
Well, look, I mean, NIL is going to change over time. The way players are compensated is going to change over time. And in fact, organizations that can become agile and can take advantage of those changes quickest are going to be the ones that flourish. And so one of the worrying things about the Rashada situation and Florida in general in the NIL era is that they have not been at the forefront of being able to take advantage of the NIL changes that have come in after the NCAA versus Alston decision, where Justice Kavanaugh essentially blasted the NCAA. One of the reasons, in fact, the main reason NIL exists today is because the NCAA went, whoa, we don't want a lawsuit coming after our TV money. Let's allow these guys to get paid. But, beyond the article you just referenced, Texas A&M's Booster Club, the 12th Man Foundation, has decided to get into the NIL business and help facilitate deals. And that's very different than what NIL was originally intended to be, right? To have a booster club, because it doesn't have any paid employees from the university, they're going to argue that that booster club is separate from the university and can offer NIL deals. Now, some of the booster clubs that at different schools have paid university employees on them. Are you going to see schools just basically kick those guys out of the booster clubs so that they can build those into NIL organizations? What is that going to look like? So that's a change that's coming much, much sooner than the stuff you just talked about. But the stuff that happened in Philadelphia in this Johnson versus NCAA deal is a huge deal. And from the standpoint of, they're saying that if Florida has a football player who's getting paid an NIL deal through a collective, but also that the NCAA is essentially restricting that person's ability to make a living, that he's co-employed by the NCAA and the University of Florida, which means that all of a sudden you've got other incentives in terms of some of these major conferences and major schools may break away from the NCAA, because breaking away from the NCAA will mean these players are no longer co-employed. But when you do that, you'll have to treat them as employees, right? You're not going to be able to break away and go, oh yeah, it's just amateurism. You still get to go to school. So I don't think anybody really, I think most of us know where this is going to land. We don't know when it's going to land there. So over the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, there's going to be constant churn and constant change in terms of how players are compensated, the model that they're compensated with, the model of NIL, the way NIL things are structured. I mean, you're seeing it right now, right? I mean, Florida comes in after a year where their teams are getting drilled from an NIL perspective and in the recruiting, and goes and changes the law to make the law more commensurate with the other laws that are out there. You've seen the NCAA lobby to get more uniform NIL laws at a federal level. They've asked for federal antitrust exemption, which that isn't going to fly because nobody at the federal level wants to be seen as taking advantage of college students. So again, I think we all know where this is going. Now, the Johnson case will get decided. It'll make the players employees, but it's only going to mandate that they pay the minimum wage and some other things. So it's not going to immediately open them up to having like collective bargaining like they do in the NFL. But that's coming, right? It's going to come at some point. The question is going to be, how long do the old fogies who are in charge drag their feet? Do they just decide, look, let's and this is one of those things that I just don't know the answer to. Because if I'm somebody who's 65, 66, 67 years old, or maybe even 60, and I go, I can drag this out for 5 years, maximize revenue in a way that maybe isn't the most ethical thing in the world to do, but makes more money for my organization. Well, is there value to doing that? Versus, do you want to be the guy who comes in and says, no, we're actually going to make this change? And in some ways, there's like a first mover. There's a lack of incentive to be the first mover, right? If like Texas decided to just separate from the NCAA, well, what if nobody goes with them? Well, now Texas has just forfeited all the dollars associated with it. So you're almost going to have conferences take the lead and say, we're going to separate. We're going to make sure that this stuff happens. And then, look, the court did not buy the Title IX argument as a valid argument. They basically said every business has to deal with constraints and has to deal with complying with the law. You're going to have to comply with the law too. Now, there are going to be some unintended consequences to that. But again, I just go back to, regardless of what happens with the NIL law in Florida, with Texas A&M generating this collective with its boosters, with the Johnson case that's maybe going to make players employees, things are going to constantly change every year. And we just need to keep that in mind, that there's constantly going to be updates to who can get paid, who they can get paid by, how much they can get paid, all those sorts of things, and who can be involved in negotiating the payment. That's going to be a constantly evolving thing. And the teams that win are going to be the ones who look at the letter of the law, decide where they can gain an edge, where maybe they can skirt the letter of the law to get an edge that other people aren't necessarily willing to take. And then, eventually it's going to force people to make changes, which is essentially what happened in Florida, right? Florida ostensibly was probably trying to stay within the letter of the law. Some other programs were not staying within the letter of that law, and in order to catch up, the law gets changed. And so, I suspect that's just what we're going to see over and over and over again over the next 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, and probably plenty more news to come this offseason as well. So we'll have plenty more opportunities to talk about NIL on this show. So let's move on to dollar here. Talk about the Gators' investment into the program. Will, this is something you hammered for a long time about the difference in spending toward the recruiting and off-field operations between the Alabama and Georgias of the world and the rest of the SEC. You've made a lot of charts on that. I've seen many charts from you on that. But this is from Kevin Brockway on the Gainesville Sun. Florida football invested heavily in the support staff in year one of the Billy Napier era. According to NCAA financial report figures, the Gators outspent their 4 major rivals in support staff, including 2-time defending national champion Georgia. Florida spent $7.3 million, north of $7.3 million in support staff in the fiscal year 2021-2022, close to $1 million more than Georgia's 6.3 and more than twice as much as Florida State's $3.2 million. Tennessee spent $5.2 million, while LSU spent $4.9 million. So Florida bumped up the size of its support staff from 45 under Dan Mullen to 62 under Napier in efforts to improve athlete performance, recruiting, and quality control.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see whether it pays off. I think at this point, looking at it a year in, you'd say, I'm not sure we've necessarily seen the benefit yet. But again, in a rebuild, I'm not sure that you necessarily expect to see the benefit in year one. And so that's going to be the question, is going to be, do we start to see the benefit and the payoff of that support staff as we move forward? Are the one-score victories going to start to come more often because they've got better advanced scouting? Are the development or the ability to find guys who are sort of diamonds in the rough, is that going to show up because they've got more guys out on the trail hitting those, doing the film evaluation, the stat evaluation and all that, and really just talking at the camps and that sort of stuff to make sure that they understand the different kids that they're bringing in. Look, I think we all know that Napier's Army, that was sort of the moniker coming into this season. I think it's easy to mock it from the standpoint of what happened this year and the lack of development that we saw, quite honestly, on both sides of the ball. At the same time, I think, it's the same thing with just about anybody. You can't gauge how they do in the first year. The question is, what's the jump, right? So the support staff was involved, but was also trying to catch up. And I know I've heard Napier say this over the last couple of weeks, is that, that first year you're trying to catch up. You're playing you got a bunch of different hats on. And so, that excuse doesn't exist anymore. These guys should all be focused on exactly what their job is in year two. And we should see significant development from every area of the team this year, because they're not going to stop spending money on the support staff. Like, that money is there. It's allocated. It's one of the things Napier asked for when he came to Florida to make sure that he was able to succeed. And so I'm glad that they're spending the money. I mean, I'm glad that they have brought in those guys to make and women to make the support staff there to support the organization and support the players. And now it's time to deliver, right? You don't get to write a $7 million check and go 6 and 7 over and over and over again. At some point, you got to start seeing improvement in every aspect. And the fact that you've got 62 people, if you've got 62 people who are driving forward all in one direction, if they're rowing in the same direction, you ought to see significant improvement from year one to year two.
Well, it was an area where we weren't necessarily competitive with Georgia and Alabama, to where now we're more than competitive in that particular area. So, yeah, things take more. Sometimes it takes more than a year to turn the whole ship around. It's big operation.
Well, I don't want to lose to them at anything. That's always the thing that drives me nuts about recruiting, is you sit there and get your butt whipped by 7 different SEC teams in the recruiting rankings, and then everybody's like, "Well, we'll beat them on the field with coaching." I'm like, "No, let's beat them everywhere." Like, let's beat them when it comes to spending on support staff. Let's beat them on having better stadiums. Let's beat them on sponsorships. Let's have better sponsorships, better TV deals, better fan experience, whatever it is, right? Like, University of Florida, I want to be the premier program in the state of Florida. Some of that is recruiting, obviously. I want to whip everybody there. But all these other things, I think you want to make sure that you are the premier program. And that is one of the things that this indicates, is that Florida has decided that they are going to invest in order to make this a premier program, because they're investing more than anybody else is in the support staff. it's going to have to pay off at some point in the near future. Otherwise, you say, well, do we really need that level of support staff? But I think, given what Saban's been able to do with the support staff that he brings in, all the analysts, certainly Kirby, and you mentioned Tennessee in terms of their spending, everyone is doing this. It's an arms race in terms of bringing in that support staff. So Napier's not any different. And the fact that they're outspending people in the SEC, I think is a good thing in terms of you're going to have to gain somewhere. And this is one place where they have an edge.
Well, that's it for this week, everybody. We'll be back next week on Stand Up and Holler. For Will Miles, I'm Nick Knutson. Have a great weekend. Go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles. And as always, go Gators.